All right, we're live. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Marco. That's unimportant because you're here for the other three folks. But if you're to make sure you're in the right place, we are talking about if employment is the holy grail of settlement, why aren't we better at it? A good question for all times, but especially lately. We're seeing report after report coming out talking about this and tons of efforts inside and outside of our sector. So I'm just going to walk you through really quickly what we're going to do. Nick is going to go first to talk about there is no settlement without employment. Why are we not focused on this? He'll be followed up by Michael, who will talk about all roads lead to employment success. And then Patrick will give us the employer's perspective, connecting settlements and selection to employer needs. You have access to the Q&A, so please post your questions there. Each presenter will go in that order, Nick, then Michael, then Patrick, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So, but during the presentations, please feel free to post in. So without further ado, Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Marco. 1 second, I'm doing things at the same time. Here we go. Okay. All right. There is no settlement without employment. All you have to do is talk to an immigrant, and they'll turn around and tell you that. The challenge is always this: when we talk to newcomers and we have these conversations with them, and we go into all the various systems that we have. The first thing they want to know is, how do I get a job? We cannot talk about settlement without employment. So let's take a look very quickly at the numbers. So the numbers we know, all of us know. I'm not going to take too much time on this, but I'm going to move to the next slide, which is the alarming slide. When you look at this, you see that the amount of funding for employment-related services is the lowest. I can't understand this. I could not understand this. I sent this slide to Marco a couple of months ago, and I couldn't understand this, and I still can't understand this. And then we get into details over here. So if we go into details, this gives you an understanding of where the money goes. So language gets 28%. Info and orientation gets 19%. Again, employment services, 9%. Why? I don't understand this. And I believe some part of this is also related to the funding which goes for upskilling your credentials in Canada. So it's the lowest number, and I cannot figure out. I know maybe I've got much smarter people than I am on this call, and I'd really love to hear that, but it doesn't make sense to me. So 9% out of 142. ESDC says, well, employment will be priority linked with regulated professions only. So that's why you have the FCRO program, but there's no program for newcomers. I don't understand why. If you look at these numbers, economic class principal applicants and spouses account for over 50%. So let me take a step back. When I've been in this area for a while, and then during the pandemic, it suddenly struck me that a lot of immigrants were having a challenge. So I reached out to them on LinkedIn and said, if anyone's struggling, send me a message and I'd love to talk to you. I was overwhelmed with that. I had to take that post off because I had far too many people who came in. But I started working with 26 people. I started helping them. And what I'd do is I would match someone with another person. So I match an immigrant with someone from their profession. So I'd match engineers. I'd match HR people who are working. So what happened was that because of this entire connection that I started doing for them, I found that in 6 weeks' time, all the work that I had for the 6 weeks previous wasn't finished because they were all working. They were working because they were able to talk to an immigrant from their profession who's working. I mean, it's common sense. If if one looks at it from that perspective. When I came here, when I came to Canada, I came with 23 years experience in advertising, handling brands like Coca-Cola and BMW. And all I wanted to do is to talk to another immigrant who is working in that same profession. It's really hard for newcomers to talk to strangers. You know, we deal with a whole lot of barriers. For example, newcomers come here, they don't know how to use LinkedIn. Most of them do not have LinkedIn accounts. On an average, I speak to about 3,500 immigrants just through our Wednesday networking calls. And I know that they're not ready for this. They're not prepared. On an average, we have about 10,000 immigrants going through our program every year. And if you were to ask me how many of that 10,000 are ready to go for an interview the next day, that percentage would surprise you. It's probably 3 to 4%. It's not that they're not smart; they're very smart, but their smarts aren't being translated into the Canadian workplace. So, are there settlement agencies who cover base employment? Yes, they do, but it is not occupation specific. It's not profession specific. So you're not matching someone based on their profession. So while I want to say that yes, basic information on finding a resume, job tips, the job bank, all that stuff is great. But the immigrants come here with experience in hundreds of professions, regulated and unregulated. They need to speak to someone who's going to tell them, how did I, as an immigrant, get a job? How can you get a job? That's what we did with the immigrant networks. We connected them. And what happened? 70% of them got a job in their profession. Boom. What do they need to know? They need to understand, how do they network? Networking is such a North American thing. We don't even realize how alien it is to people below the equator. Simple. They don't know how to network. How to use LinkedIn? How do you use LinkedIn? I've seen so many people who've got LinkedIn profiles which are actually harmful for them. What is needed is to have a network that helps them connect with people, helps them go and get digital mentorship and coaching, all of them at the same time. That's what we do at Immigrant Networks. We have a 9-step, 90-day program that guarantees you success, 90% success if you follow all the 9 steps. We cannot continue to do the same thing over and over again that we have been doing and expect that the outcome is going to change. The outcome has to be focused on employment. Everything else, immigrants are going to figure out. The other thing that I've found talking to newcomers is they'll figure out everything else. They'll figure out where to stay. They'll figure out what to do. They'll figure out how to buy a car. They'll figure out all of that stuff because this is the era that was born with the cell phone in their hand. We did a poll to find out from our audience, how do you prefer accessing services? Online is 50%. Hybrid is 33%, and in-person is less than 15%. We asked newcomers, our audience, what do you suggest that newcomers should do when they land in Canada? They said connect with immigrant networks. The benefit of the settlement agency is now starting to be questionable. We have to change the settlement agency. That has to become more digital, and it has to become more, well, it has to also have the hybrid part. But the point is, if the government does not fund it, it goes back to the first slide. If the emphasis is not on employment, it's on everything else but employment, I don't know how we're going to get people hired. I don't know how we're going to get people working. This is not a huge sample size, but it gives you an idea. This is a 9-step, 90-day program. This is how we are tackling this. Our audience get jobs on an average between 40 to 60 days. We teach them networking. How do you network? And we start networking with something that's going to bring a smile to your face. We ask them to go to a grocery store, look for someone who doesn't look like them, and ask them about broccoli. Is this a green cauliflower? We ask them to ask these questions so that they can start getting used to speaking to strangers. Newcomers don't want to travel 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers to learn something which they can pick up online. So this is where we're at. 16,000 of our members are working in their profession. Our cost per client is $100, 70% success rate. We still need to start asking the question, why are we doing this with such low amount of funding for employment? Thank you. Michael, over to you.
Great, thank you, Nick. Just give me a second here. Give me a thumbs up if you don't mind, if you can see my presentation. Great, fantastic, thank you. All right, well, I really hope that you're all having a fantastic day here at P2P conference so far. I want to start by thanking Marco for getting the panelists, Nick, Patrick, and myself together to talk about this very important topic around employment. Really, really honored to be here. I want to start with a quote, knowing that we are in a critical time where there's a lot of change happening. In this sector, providing services related to newcomers and employment services, we're all facing an enormous amount of change and challenges at the same time. And as I take a step back and I think about all these challenges that we've gone through or we're about to go through together, this is the quote that kind of came up in my mind from Charles Darwin saying, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but it is the most responsive to change that will survive, that will be successful. And so this one really resonated well with me. I'm not gonna spend too much time here, but for those of you who didn't know Achieve yet, we have a long history in this sector providing services in multiple areas, including employment, newcomer services, language, women, youth, as well as IT solutions. And out of the 60 programs that we currently provide, we serve to about 110,000 clients a year, where 80,000 of them are newcomers. And our purpose is all about creating faster paths to prosperity for our clients. And so this topic today is really near and dear to our hearts. And so creating a faster path to prosperity, what does that mean? And how do we do this? Well, first and foremost, our mission is to make it easier for our clients to access services that they need, when they need them, how they need them, and where they need them. And ultimately, this is about the integrated experience and reducing the barriers that they encounter. We, at the same time, we also asked our clients, how would they define prosperity from their perspectives? And here are the 4 areas that they told us: financial stability, well-being, community, and growth. And out of the 4, financial stability is the #1 category, in that they worried about. And this really has a lot to do with employment as well as entrepreneurship, maybe some financial literacy, but having a stable source of income through employment is top of mind for our clients. And this is, again, directly linked to the topic that we're talking about today. We also ask our clients the same question around barriers. What are the barriers that you encounter? And these are newcomer clients that are fairly new in the country, And as they think about their top areas, employment information, not enough, online services and language all came back as the top answers. And again, employment sits at the top of the list. And I hope you can start seeing there's a pattern here. So I promise I will keep the data slides to a minimum, but there's a couple slides that I thought I wanted to share with you. I'm going to start with this chart that shows our history of employment rate dating back to 2010. And you can see that over a bit of, a decade or so, we've slowly picking up our employment rate over the years, with the exception of 2020, when COVID started. And so it looks like, when it comes to employment, we seem to be doing better than ever. It seems to be really working out well. But if you look closely, you'll see that there's a gap between Canadian-born and immigrants less than 10 years when it comes to employment rate. Now, why don't we look even closer? What's under the surface? Using 2023 data, we look at unemployment rates in Canada was about 5.4%, which seems really low and really healthy. But when you start looking at comparison of the unemployment rates, for newcomers was at about 8.8%. While, the youth is close to 11% unemployment. And this gap, between Canada average and the newcomers is a massive gap. And it's even bigger when we compare with the youth population. And there's an estimation that was done in a study that says about $25 billion in GDP growth that was lost due to unemployment that we just talked about. This is not a small number by any means. All right, well, why don't we look at the breakdown even more by age, okay? When we use data points from October 2024, so this is fairly recent, our unemployment rate was about 5.4%. Looks healthy for those over 25 and above. But when we look at the youth category, 12.8% was the unemployment rate. This is between 18 and 24. But the reality is when you look at newcomer youth, the number is astonishing at 22.8%. And this is a huge gap between, the 5.4 and the 12.8. So it's clear that we can see that, when you look at these numbers a little bit more closer, we're able to see where the challenges start to occur and where the problematic areas are. And this is all having a huge impact on our growth, our economy. And if we really think about for us to grow and compete as a country, we really have to not lose sight of investing in our youth so that we're set up for our future. And by the way, if you haven't seen it yet, King's Trust Canada published a very comprehensive report on this topic of youth unemployment. So if you haven't seen it, feel free to go check it out. Okay, so I promise I'll stop boring you with numbers. But now that we've seen the numbers and really quantifying the problems and really start to see the comparison, let's take a moment and talk about why this is happening. We could be spending a lot of time debating about why this, why that. Nick touched on some of these reasons earlier, but there's really a couple of reasons that stand out for me that I wanted to focus on, for a couple of minutes here. And for me, it really has to do with expectations. Expectations go both ways. When it comes to youth, we have heard that so many jobs are looking for a top education degree. They're looking for someone with years of experience, multiple skill sets. Oh, and you got to be bilingual as well. And by the way, it's a job that pays for $20 or less. And that just isn't right. And so, it's very difficult to want to hire people in a way that's just not reasonable enough, not feasible and not realistic. And so employers will really have to think about their expectations. But on the flip side, we also have seen and heard a lot of newcomers come to Canada with higher degree and higher education background than ever. And yet they struggle with finding jobs for multiple range of reasons. But it really comes down to they want to find a job that is aligned with their experience and their skill sets. They have expectations, and this is fantastic. But sometimes, we've seen newcomers come to Canada with expectation that it has to be one job and one job only that they have in mind. And this is limiting their opportunities. And on the flip side, we've also seen people having to take survival jobs, which is understandable, if there's a reality and there's a reality, but the survival jobs are not sustainable, and which sometimes can be compounding the issue. And so, there's a number of challenges and reasons behind the scenes for why we are where we are, why we're seeing employment challenges, but really, really has to do with us taking a step back and rethinking about expectations and how we help each other. So what can we all do to help? Well, there's a quote that comes to my mind as well by Henry Ford. Coming together is a beginning, staying together is a progress, and working together is success. So what are we doing here at Achieve? Well, number one is we're doubling down on employment. It all starts with employment services. We're looking at improving our service model and our client experience all the time. But this is really for both the job seekers and the employers. And you really can't have employment success without one or the other. The second thing here is that innovation is key. And we believe that this is, one of the major changes that need to take place for things also to improve and to elevate and to evolve. And it's one of the top priorities here at Achieve. And one example is our omnichannel that we're creating to connect our clients, our job seekers, our employers, and our partners even more integrated and more seamless than before by breaking down some of the top barriers that we just touched on. Number three is that Achieve has a long history of track record in the sector by focusing on partners and other stakeholders in the industry, in the sector. Whether you are nonprofits or the private sector, we work together knowing that this is what's going to get us there faster and easier. So partnership is extremely important. And last but not the least is really being more informed about how we can deliver services, how we can enhance client experience and their journey, helping them with their journey even better than before. But we're just one organization, and there's not a single silver bullet that is going to address all the gaps that we talked about. And the reality is just, Henry Ford's quote comes to mind again, is the reality is that it will take all of us to take action to make this work. So my call to action to all of you, depending on who you are and the role that you play, if you are an employer, please keep an open mind, invest more in human capital. Newcomers bring a ton of potential in talent, skill sets, but you also don't have to do it alone. Let us help you. And I know that Patrick is probably going to touch on this topic even more in his presentation, but this is really a key piece of the puzzle is the employer piece that we also have to help you be successful as well. When it comes to job seekers, my call to action to you would be to do your due diligence up front. Seeking jobs, we all know that this is going to take a lot of support and effort. And being new in Canada, we know it's a transition. It's not easy by any means, but understand the changes and adapt accordingly. And again, you don't have to do it alone. There's a ton of support resources as well as organizations like Achieve that are here to help you with your journey. So reach out and we can help you. If you are a service provider organization or one of the SPOs, just like we are, my recommendation is to know your audience and your clients even more, their profile, their pain points, the challenges, but also the opportunities at the same time. Your audience is more than just the individual clients. It's also the employer, going back to the employer piece being a key piece of the puzzle. Focus on the individual job seeker is a good thing, but just know that employers are the other half of the equation. If you are a product or service provider in the sector focusing on solving employment-related problems, I would encourage you to really think about what problem are you solving for, and design your solution to address the actual use cases, whether it's a technology or a service. The reality is this sector really needs a lot of help from product and service organizations to help us move forward, to help us bridge the gap, to help us be more efficient, and to drive that result faster as well. And if you are a funder, it's really unfortunate that the reality is we are all incentivized to operate in a very specific way. And, my opinion is that we really need the funders in this sector to, number one, continue to provide the right amount of funding to help us solve these problems. And again, Nick touched on that earlier. But at the same time, it's also about providing funding with the right parameters, with the right goal in mind, thinking about how do we use the funding to drive outcomes, not outputs, outcomes. And we really need the funders to help us, operate that way and help us drive those outcomes in a sustainable way. Last but not the least, if you are with one of the education institutions or training providers, I really suggest that you think about creating programs, training programs that link to employment. There are so many jobs in industries that need very specialized skill sets that require specialized training. And this is where the opportunity comes in. This is a direction that immediately then directly impacts employment with the right skill sets and the right training. So I've, just to wrap up, I just want to say that I've met so many wonderful people in this sector who are passionate about helping people, helping employment, helping newcomers and youth, all of the above. I'm really, really encouraged by the people that I've met, including this panel and outside of this panel, where there's a lot of desire, there's a lot of dedication to want to help move forward. And it really, really takes a village for us to make a difference, in this topic. I will share, but you may be thinking, well, this is so difficult, this is so impossible. Well, it's not. There's also a lot of successful stories. There's one that stands out here at Achieve that I'd love to share. There was one client of ours who is very highly skilled, a newcomer, but very highly skilled with cybersecurity background, who came to Canada about a year ago, and he just couldn't find a job himself, no matter how hard he tried. We're talking about a very highly skilled and educated individual. And he eventually came to Achieve, where we helped him put through a program with a lot of changes, advice, with a lot of job search and preparation process, as well as learning how to promote himself. And we were eventually able to help him land a position with one of the largest financial institutions in Canada with a 6-figure total compensation. And, and this is one perfect example to say, with the right mindset, the right effort, the right support system, we know we can make a difference. So if you wish to connect with me or Achieve about anything, in regards to how we can support each other or partner with each other, feel free to reach out. But I just want to thank you for your time, and thank you for playing a role to help make a difference. With that said, I'm going to hand it over to you, Patrick.
Great, thank you, Michael. Okay, let me just make sure I've got the right screen up. Okay. Hi there, everybody. Look, it's really a pleasure to be here. This is actually the first P2P that I've participated in, so it's very nice to be able to share the panel with Nick and Michael and Marco here, certainly. And these are folks who I always, in organizations, I always look to see how we can be doing things well and how we can be doing things better when it comes to the impact that we're trying to have. So I'm going to speak really about what we're hearing from the employers with whom we engage. Because ultimately, I think we need to keep in mind that when we talk about employment and we talk about people finding that meaningful employment, it's ultimately by and large, it's ultimately the employer who's the gatekeeper. We talk about foreign credential recognition. We talk about doctors driving cabs and whatnot quite regularly because it makes for a convenient narrative. But I think we need to step back a little bit and look more broadly at what's actually going on in the economy. Who are the employers and what are those jobs that are out there? And so I guess just briefly to describe the Immigrant Employment Council of British Columbia, we're very proud to be a part of the settlement sector, but we're also very proud of the perspective that we come at it, from which we come at it. So we're looking more so at the employer perspective here. IECBC was created in 2008 when some leaders in the province, recognized that there were some tremendous organizations doing work to get immigrants ready for the labor market. But they asked the question of who's getting the labor market ready for immigrants, who's helping employers understand that there is an immigrant talent pool, and that it's actually quite deep and quite rich. And how do they access it? How do they recruit, hire, and retain? So we're driven by employer insights. We're constantly working to understand what employers need and then refine what we offer and the intelligence and analysis that we provide to our partners to help others create programming that responds to that employer need. These are just a few of the examples of how we work with employers. We have an employer advisory group, fluctuates from about 17 to 25 members at any given point, or over the years, I should say, where employers have real, meaningful, and deep conversations with us on a regular basis on some of the issues and some of the challenges that they're facing. I'll speak briefly about our Engaging SMEs project, keeping in mind that SMEs are the lion's share of the employers in Canada and where the jobs are by and large. I also want to talk about our feedback forums. This is a relatively new project that we have where we're trying to link together our employer consultative capacity across the Immigrant Employment Council network from coast to coast. And then just another example are some of the advisory groups that we have that are program or project specific. Our Ascend program, which is a workplace readiness program, as well as our FAST program, which is a skills assessment program to help people move into specific occupations. And we work closely with employers to make sure that they're relevant and that will meet employer needs. So I'll talk briefly about the SME, the Engaging SME project. And so really, we talk about small to medium-sized enterprises. We know there are a lot of challenges when it comes to them being able to incorporate some of the hiring practices that we talk about that help remove barriers that keep an employer from finding the right talent. And I think that's an important perspective. It's what can we do to help the employer make sure that they're not missing out on finding folks who can really help propel their organizations. And so they face some unique challenges that larger employers don't. And of course, each SME itself is unique. So that, it poses some challenges around scale and providing turnkey solutions to those employers. So we wanted to bridge the gap by engaging with some SMEs to help them create or co-create with us some tailored solutions to help overcome these challenges. So in the project, we talked to 127 SMEs. And you can see in the company size, a little more than half were 100 to 500 employees. And then a little less than half, of course, under 100 employees. And talked to folks in manufacturing, professional, scientific, and technical services, healthcare and social assistance, another one. And construction, you see, is sort of the smaller representation there as well. Keeping in mind that, if you talk about professional, scientific, you talk about healthcare and social assistance in particular, and construction, key areas that Canadians are focused on right now in terms of meeting labor market demand. Employers, the 127 SMEs that we spoke to in this project, they really spoke to the challenges in navigating the complexity of the immigration programs and the streams that are there, and understanding how they might be able to work with them. Employers felt that they didn't have, they didn't really have the resources to assess, skills or foreign credentials. In Canada, we use credentials as a shorthand for ability, generally, because if you think about it, 80% of the labor market's unregulated. So you're not actually looking for a credential, you're looking to see if someone can solve your problems as a hiring manager. And when we use credentials as a shorthand for ability, it works well enough in a domestic context, but to data that Michael put up earlier, we see that there's almost a total breakdown when it comes to applying that metric or that measurement on foreign credentials. But it also suggests that leads us to believe that, or it leads me to the conclusion, anyways, that the conversation around foreign credentials is distracting us from where we could have some real impact on getting people into meaningful jobs. Small businesses felt that the competition with larger firms, it's really hard. It's hard if you're a small business competing with a TELUS or an RBC or others who have a sophisticated HR capacity, and they've already figured out how to tap into these more diverse talent pools. And again, I think this ties very closely to that lack of resources to onboard and retain. There's also a question of leadership buy-in. In some of these small businesses, do the leaders in the organization actually, are they putting the focus and the effort into being more broad in their hiring practices? And when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which we often do in these spaces, but it's also about giving a business owner or a hiring manager the ability to understand that you're maximizing the available talent pool that is out there, and you want to make sure that you're not ignoring that these folks who could bring so much to the workplace. One of the things that we learned with the SMEs is they get consulted all the time. There's always a survey, or there's always somebody reaching out to speak to them, but they want meaningful and tailored engagement. So they don't want it to be transactional, but they want to understand that when they are participating, that it's going somewhere. It's moving towards something genuine and something that's going to be productive. But also it can't be one and done. I suppose that that speaks to the moving beyond transactional piece. So they need to know that you're going to be there and that you can help answer their questions and guide them along and help reduce that perceived risk of opening up their hiring practices to folks who don't necessarily fit the mold that they've always used. And again, I didn't speak to that leadership commitment. It's if the leaders aren't buying into this and living what it is that they're saying, you're not going to see that translate down through the organization. Just to move on from the SMEs, and I will apologize if it seems like I'm moving through some of this a little quickly. There's a lot that we've uncovered over the last year or so, and I'm very happy to share the presentation out with everyone afterwards that has a little more detail for you. The Strengthening Employer Feedback Channels project that we're working on, this is a joint project with the other immigrant employment councils of Canada. And so we work with a number of like-minded organizations. There's 12 of us nationally, and there's 8 or 10 participating in this project right now. And we're talking to businesses and business owners across the country and trying to understand what it is that they think around immigration and settlement and some of the challenges that they're facing, and seeing do they have thoughts on selection? Do they have thoughts on the programming and how we can make things better? But also, can we enlighten them on what some of the and dispel some of the myths that are out there? So you can see the folks who are attending these forums. And in terms of who comes in, and the vast majority, the lion's share, almost half, are employers or hiring managers who are showing up along with other members of the community and institutions. And while we're focused on employers, it's important that everyone is in the room, because of course immigration is not an IRCC event. Employment is not simply an employer responsibility. There are all these other pieces that come into play, and then we need this machine working well together. So we talk about the size of the size of the organizations. About 22% are large or 500 plus organizations, but we are seeing, again, many small, micro, and medium size coming in to talk to us. And again, this is purposeful for us because of the importance that SMEs play in the economy. For those of you who've heard me talk before, I'll make the comment that in Canada, it's a very different economy here in the United States simply because of the composition. We don't really have national champions in the same way that the Americans or other countries might have. And they say Tim Hortons is our national champion, but we don't own it, and it's still just a collection of small businesses, self-franchisees. And so that, to me, that emphasizes the challenge that we face and making sure that employers can do their best to be open to all talent that comes across the table. So you can see in the last year, we've had 43 of these forums from, again, right across the country, with about 560 individuals who have participated in the conversations. You can speak to the industries that are there, educational services, public admin, again, healthcare and social assistance factors in there quite a bit, and then construction as well. So of course, what you really want to hear is, what are we hearing? So I thought this here was of interest to me. Is that folks are seemingly confident in understanding the factors of immigrant employment, and then they're seemingly seemingly confident, and then they say it's very important or extremely important here to having inclusive hiring practices. But then as we move through, we also see that the familiarity of the immigration and settlement system, and I'm not sure that employers are making the distinction between selection and settlement here necessarily. So necessarily what the government's doing and what the rest of us are trying to do after folks get here. But they say that folks are sort of somewhat familiar by and large, and you get a very similar number saying that in terms of alignment of the immigration system with their needs, is that it's somewhat aligned. And so to me, again, I think this speaks to people's uncertainty around it. They may have some dealings with it. It may have worked out okay for them, but not necessarily entirely smoothly. Especially when they're trying to find folks, in particular, if they're trying to bring folks in from overseas. Here, almost, over 86% of the participants said that they've hired an immigrant, which isn't surprising given the composition of the Canadian labor market and how many newcomers there are in Canada. But even though 86% of them have done the hiring, very few of them feel that they're actually ready to incorporate inclusive practices into their workplace. And this, I think, speaks to a nervousness that employers can feel about getting things wrong. And then, but also I think it also speaks to a perceived risk of hiring folks where they don't fully understand necessarily the skills or experience that they're bringing to the table. So when we were doing some of the analysis here and going through it, we kind of overlaid the government's sort of strategic review of immigration over some of the over the comments that we were getting. Because and actually, and I should have pointed this out earlier, both of these projects I've talked about are IRCC funded projects as well, or the SME one was funded by IRCC. There's some work that's coming out of that Wes has kindly offered to support as well. So we're building out sort of an employer navigator out of that. But in terms of looking at how we might move forward with some of what we're hearing from employers, it's kind of three main areas that with some focused actions that come out of each. And so there's creating a more welcoming experience for newcomers, aligning immigration with labor market needs, and this is an area of particular importance to me, and then developing a comprehensive and coordinated growth plan. And so these themes all help to inform some of the conversations that we were having. I'm not going to go into huge depth on some of this stuff. Creating a more welcoming experience for newcomers. No surprise, folks want shorter wait times and improved service standards. What exactly folks mean by that, not always able to articulate. But generally speaking, and I am sympathetic with employers certainly on this, I don't believe any wait time is short enough for them. So how we communicate with them in terms of the why things may take the time they do is going to be important. Here in the middle is sort of a key piece that we kept coming out, though. It's sort of strengthening the partnerships with employers and institutions that rely on immigration. There's a real opportunity to change, I think, or tweak our selection system so that employers are far more central to who comes in the country on the economic selection side of things. And as Nick was showing earlier, like economic selection is the lion's share of who we're bringing in. And so if we're, and I think it begs the question, if we're bringing in, if such a significant portion of the selection is around economic immigrants, primarily on principal applicants I'm talking about here too, but we need to understand why there would be such uptake on settlement services and what types of settlement services that they're using. That could help us figure out if we are getting selection right. I'm not saying our selection system is awful, not by any stretch, but could we be doing it better? I'd say absolutely. And Michael's number of $25 billion left on the table in terms of unrealized GDP through immigrant underemployment and unemployment. It's actually, Stats Canada's numbers are actually significantly lower than what RBC's numbers would be on that. They were upwards of $50 billion even before COVID. So. I mean, in the end, what I think the way I would sum it up is, on the welcoming experience for newcomers, and this is for the employer as well, is that, SMEs need practical and easy to use solutions, turnkey solutions that work for an SME. Now, most, and Nick had data, this is actually part of the problem with going last, is I'd love to change my presentation entirely once I start listening to Nick and Michael. But you can see the types of services that newcomers are looking for, the in-person, the virtual, and the sort of the hybrid. What we're finding is that the more hands-on you can be with someone, the better the outcomes will be. But of course, that's not scalable. And so how do we find that sweet spot to give those turnkey solutions to SMEs to help them remove those barriers that keep people from making best use of their skills? Not an immigration issue in particular, though the narrative publicly is trying to link these to them. Housing and transportation, and it's transportation issues for newcomers, and we see this in BC all the time. There are employers looking to hire. They're not on a bus route. They're not on the train route. It's not easy for folks to get there. And so, what are some of the innovative solutions, or what's some of the coordination that can be done between sort of the immigration system, the public transport system, or others to help make it easier for workers to get to work? And housing, that's certainly a much larger question than we're going to answer here. For years, probably 5-6 years ago, employers started asking me, like, so what are you going to do about housing? And I thought, and I look at my business card and I think, well, like, where do you see housing in here? But really, I should have been paying closer attention to what they were saying, because there was way more to it than I realized at the time, clearly. And then, one of the challenges that employers keep coming to us with is they don't know that services are out there. And they're not attuned to the fact that there is a settlement sector here that is, that has a lot of money spent on it. And so they don't know how to connect their workers to some of those other services, or for themselves access some of the other services that might be there that can help with the integration and the retention piece. So that, and so that piece there, sorry, and the flip side of that, sorry, is that while most don't know that we exist, others wonder why 12 of us call them. To say, oh, we've got some workers here, we'd like to do this, or we've got mentoring, or we've got these programs, we'd like you to participate in them. And so those who are aware would like a far more coordinated approach from our sector. I'm just fairly mindful of the time here. I'm going to hop through a few more hop through some of these a little more quickly. But again, the employers are talking about a mismatch between jobs and skills available. Honestly, what I think is happening here, it's miscommunication between the two. Immigrants themselves are not all that aware of how to sell themselves in a Canadian context. And I think this is where that Canadian experience question, it keeps coming up. And at the same time, and I mentioned earlier, employers don't know what they're looking at. Like when they see a credential from somewhere overseas, from a country they may not be able to pick off of an unlabeled map, and so neither seems to be well equipped to have a conversation that the other understands. We developed the Ascend program at IECBC, a workplace readiness program, to combat that. We had mentors and employers telling us that immigrant candidates were coming to them who were supposedly job ready. They had taken employment training, much like stuff that's been described earlier, and yet there was an unevenness to how the immigrant candidates were showing up. And so we asked them what made them say no. Like, why do you say no to a candidate? And when they told us, it mostly came down to a person's ability to sell themselves in the interview process. And so we built out the Ascend program. It's 7 modules, 8 workshops. And now we have, I think, roughly 50 organizations across the country that use this to deliver workplace readiness to their people or to their clients. And it really meets the needs of the employer. And at the same time, we need to do more work to help employers better understand what that is, what the talent is that's being put in front of them. Again, spoke to this. We've spoke to these issues, or I've spoken to these issues already in a couple of instances. This move towards competency-based hiring practices. Employers are interested, they just don't know how to do it. Get away from credentials and more towards skill and ability. See, my title's CEO. Nobody asked me for a transcript, right? No, nobody asked me to see my diploma. They just needed to know I could solve their problems. And I was able to get the job. The professional language and professional practical language and cultural competency training. Nick talked about how much money is spent on language training, and I think we need to be looking at more innovative solutions to this. Be it technology, where do we meet the people? Is it virtually? Is it how? Depending on who's there, or is it in the workplace? And this one here, and we can talk about this certainly all day long. I'll kind of end on this point here. Employers are asking us to be much more coordinated. And I think we're seeing this with the response in the levels plan, where the numbers have changed because of, we see what absorptive capacity of communities. But even at our own level as organizations, we need to be much better at understanding what each other's doing and working together to present that. And I know, and I agree with what Michael said around sort of the funding models and how it engenders competition. And I agree, like I do agree with that. But I also think that the leaders of the different settlement organizations, we need to step back and say, okay, how do we make this work on our level? And what is that? We need to drive that cooperation, much like we're looking for the leadership in these companies to say we need to be open to immigrant talent and bringing them on board. And in doing so, I think we help strengthen Canada's ability to position the immigration system to adapt quickly and respond to what's going on in the world. So be it another Ukraine crisis, another Syria, or Afghanistan, or just simply making the system work better domestically. And I think anything that we can do on the economic selection and integration side will have knock-on benefits to any other person who comes here, no matter the stream. Every immigrant who comes is an economic actor, and we need to keep that in mind. And I'll leave it there, and I'll turn it back to Marco. It's like, for those who know me, I could take the next hour too. So.
Thank you, all three of you. We've got about 19 minutes left before the end, and there's been some rich Q&A happening in the Q&A. So I just want to encourage folks to continue posting questions. Most of them have been answered directly by Nick and Michael because they were specific questions to their presentation. Patrick, I'm going to start with you because those questions are going to start coming in. The work that you've done recently with employers was also done recently by the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and Deloitte, which was also done recently by World Education Services, which was also done recently by the Conference Board and you, and a number of different people. And I wonder, we're getting a lot of the similar kinds of questions, and a lot of similar answers, right? Lack of knowledge, sort of fear. One of the quotes that I have to admit I started laughing a little bit is from the ICC, where they talked about one thing employers should do is rediscover their humility and remind themselves why when someone with an unfamiliar name from an unfamiliar country and different experience comes across your desk, there's a possibility that person knows something you don't know. And that's great. And they're right. That's absolutely true. So I guess the question is, we've been doing all of these things and we've been providing handbooks and hand-ups and things like that. And small and medium, the large businesses they can invest in these kinds of things, and they do. So when the recommendation is have a DEI program, train your HR staff, the SME is like, I don't have any of those things. So what are you hearing from them around what is actually practical in terms of taking that first step, which is a risk, right? The unknown.
Well, there's a couple of really important things in there. Like, it is a really crowded space because we're all very interested in this right now. We've been having these conversations for 50, 60 years now, like, especially when we talk about the barriers to integration. And there are a number of challenges here. There's vested interests, there's inertia, there's just a lack of time, lack of resources. There's an IR, it's always worked for me this way. I'll make out fine now. Part of the problem with the tools is we come from the immigrant perspective. The immigrant's not doing the hiring, the employer is. And so, like, this isn't we need to be very careful with the language that we use. Like DE&I, some people do not respond well to that. They misunderstand what we're trying to accomplish with this. And so be mindful of who we're talking to, and communicate in language that matters to them. In the same way that when you communicate with anyone in your life who's important, you tailor the language and the communication to a way that you think they'll respond best. Businesses are in the business of making money. That's their job. That is their role. I'm the nonprofit. We're not looking to turn anyone else into one, right? And so I think we have to profit's a good thing for these guys. It's a necessary thing. And so I think as a sector, we have to step back and go, okay, like, just because they're a business doesn't mean they're bad. And not that everybody thinks that, but there is a narrative that is out there of sort of businesses looking to take advantage of newcomers. And for sure, some might, or not some might, some do. But I think we can look at the system and say, okay, well, are we bringing them in to do that on the temporary side in particular? But your point of, like, small businesses saying, well, I don't have the capacity to do this. And that's exactly it. I mean, most of them don't. There's a lot of them that are trying to make payroll, and that's what they're worried about, or not losing that big client that makes the whole business profitable. And so it's unreasonable, I think, to ask some of these guys from a corporate social responsibility side to do something different. we need to help them understand the imperative on the business side. And and Marco, I think you and I had a chat, sort of, I think over LinkedIn on this a couple of years ago, where I said, like, if they're not interested, I don't care about them. And my thing, like, a business that does not want to work with us, I don't care. I don't want to work with them because they won't be here in 5 or 10 years anyway. So I truly believe that it's those businesses that understand, the real business value, the ROI on this stuff, that they're the ones who are going to be successful. We've got a project that we're working on right now, just in British Columbia, called the Business to Business Mentoring. So we want to work with these big companies that have figured this stuff out. And what we want to do is leverage their credibility with their food chain, their clients and their suppliers, to say, okay, well, how do we translate those lessons learned from a big guy down to the little guys in practical turnkey solutions?
There's a nice follow-up to some of what you're saying in the Q&A from Samantha McLean. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing. Patrick, do you think government-funded programs should approach employers with an established onboarding strategy when trying to bridge the gap between newcomer job seekers and employers?
So I worked in Ottawa for 8 years, and the joke was, I'm from Ottawa and I'm here to help. Like, no, they don't want this from government. Like, they don't want government in there trying to sort of to meddle in things. And I would say the way the political winds are blowing, it's much less likely that you're going to see government intervention in a lot of this. And so I'd like
Sorry,
to
in this case, they're talking about government-funded programs. So the nonprofits in this case. So folks like you, would it make sense for you to come to a business and say, here's your onboarding strategy? You don't even need to think about it. I've got like everything for you, and I'll bring the talent in behind it once you agree this is the strategy.
So I'd say almost, right? Like, yes, like to be able to show up with something like this would be incredibly valuable to a lot of the businesses that we work with. I go back to the hands-on nature. It's like, how do we help them then tailor it to their specific needs? Because these businesses are all unique, animals unto themselves. But you mentioned something really important too. It's like, and then I can bring you the people. It's like, I'm not a recruitment agency, but like, what is that pipeline to get people here? And this is where we end up losing some of the partners. And Michael, I don't know if you see the same thing. It's like, we talk to them about the immigrant talent pool, and then trying to actually get that pipeline to, especially if it's folks who are still overseas, like a quick route to get folks into the workplace. That's where the system breaks down sometimes.
Well, that's where Michael and Nick come in, though, right? And that's where because you've got that pipeline, right, guys?
Absolutely. I'd be so happy. I could send a ton of really good qualified candidates to you guys.
Yeah,
both of you.
No, then this is like, again, this is how the system has to work, is that we can be doing this.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
I'll chime in just very quickly.
Yeah, please.
One of the common themes I've heard from the team working with our clients on a daily basis is that we have enough job seekers and clients that we need to help with. What we don't have is enough employers that are willing to hire, or that are on the right mindset, or that are ready to hire newcomers. And that is the gap that I keep referring to, is that we also need employers to be the other part of the equation, because without the employers, this is not going to work.
Yeah.
At this point, I want to bring up something that we're working on, Marco, Patrick, and Michael, and that is there's a startup coming out of Toronto that is going to help newcomers get 7-minute interviews with employers specific to their profession. 7-minute interviews. So these are quick ones where they can turn around and say, yes, you can go to the next stage. I think that's the best thing, because what happens is you've got someone who's actually going through the process of the interview. And every interview they get a chance, they get a little more confident, they're getting a little more hopeful. This is one solution. And so Immigrant Networks is partnering with this company to do this. So anyone who goes through my 9 steps, 90 days program, only those will be eligible to go for that.
So part of it is the coordination, and part of it is the prep. So that immigrant talent pipeline, I mean, the employer wants to know they're, quote, job ready, right? We've had job developers and we've had these kinds of programs around for many years. The challenge is the scale, right? They serve hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of people a year, but we've got hundreds of thousands of people looking for work in many cases. So so it's a question of how you can scale that up, which I think is an important piece. An interesting question from someone who I assume is from a local immigration partnership. Is there a role that LIPS can play to support small, medium enterprises to hire immigrants, or just support all of this work? Or maybe there's a coordination role they can play. What do folks think?
I mean, I think LIPS have a really important role, and that was reflected in the last call for proposals from IRCC. I mean, IRCC certainly believes in them. And I spoke earlier to sort of this lack of awareness around the other wraparound services that might be there that can either help an employer or help the newcomer. I think LIPS could certainly play a role there. I don't know if that's as a clearinghouse or if it would be connecting. Truthfully, I think there's a greater opportunity. I think there's an opportunity for IECs and LIPS to work better together so that we can act almost as that hub to strengthen the system even more.
There's another question I want to paraphrase, because I think it's really a question about, we can talk about jobs, but what about job quality and decent wages, right? Too many newcomers getting hired for low wages and in poor conditions, not just temporary workers, but PRs as well, for example. What role can we play as a sector in helping to ensure that some accountability in that hiring process as well with employers? Any thoughts? Does that come up at Achieve at all, Michael? Is that the quality of the job? Not just, we're not just shoveling talent into places, but we want to make sure that it's like you'd mentioned a really good example, someone getting six-figure compensation.
Here at Achieve, employers that we work with, they go through a rigorous process of qualifying, making sure that they are legitimate and they provide environments for employment. At the same time, nothing is always going to be 100% perfect. The particular scenario here about some of the bigger corporations and some of the jobs are just poor quality. I think this is really going to take the entire sector, all of us working together to say, okay, well, how can we help? But it has to start from somewhere. And we need to amplify our voice together by saying, well, if this is the type of environment you provide, you may not be the right type of employer we want to be working with, like what Patrick mentioned earlier, right? And those organizations that don't change, eventually they'll be left behind. There's no doubt about that. So it's in their best interest to take care of their staff, take care of their employees. And this is what I meant by investing in human capital. That's very, very important. The more we invest in them, the better they're going to contribute value-wise to help the organization, but also the entire economy. There are some concepts about employer advisory councils or boards that some of the organizations have. Maybe the sector needs a bigger advisory council that we work together, but we also connect with some of these organizations to say, how can you do differently? What can you do differently? Here's what we're seeing. Patrick, Nick, feel free to chime in your perspective.
I'll let Patrick take this one.
No, I mean, Michael, I think you're bang on with that. I mean, for us, it's like I talk about meaningful employment. It's like, is this and we talked, and I can't remember if it was Nick or if it was Michael that mentioned it earlier about helping people understand what sort of jobs might they be able to do. It might be a different title than you had at home, but how do you position yourself? How do you see where those skills could be best put to use? And it's one thing for a newcomer to see that and understand sort of how they might, you might have been called an engineer, you might have been a carpenter back home, but here, what are those skills that you bring and what are the occupations where you can best apply them? And then if there's a pathway to sort of improvement or licensure somewhere, well, then let's give folks that opportunity. But it only goes so far if the employers that they're standing in front of don't recognize it or don't want to recognize it. And a lot of it has to do, in my mind, with perceived risk. And we've talked about, like, that word's come up a few times already in the conversation today. There's a risk to hiring anybody. Like, there's a risk to hiring me, and I'm born and raised and educated and trained in Canada. What I would love to see is that our programming and our interventions as a sector help reduce that perceived risk of considering a newcomer to be equal to that of any Canadian. And I think that's because you're never going to eliminate risk.
I want to jump onto another subject that Patrick alluded to in his slides, and that is the importance of communities for newcomers. And I'm working on at Immigrant Networks. We have a massive community of newcomers. We have 800 people on our WhatsApp group, and they talk all day and all night. And the beauty is they're now moving into exactly what I wanted, and that is immigrants helping immigrants. So what happens is sometimes there'll be someone who will put in a thing saying, I have an interview tomorrow and I don't know what to do. I need someone to help me practice. You will suddenly get a whole ton of people who say, yeah, give me a call. Let's set our time. That community is so critical when you are going through this whole change. And so one of the key things that I want to talk about is how can employers look at these communities? So right now what is happening is embedded within these 800 are certain key employers whom we've invited. These employers are looking at the conversation and saying, hey, this person has a great a LinkedIn profile. Let me talk to this person. They've actually gotten hired from there.
Thank you, Nick. We're getting close to the end, so quick question for you, Patrick, that hopefully you can answer quickly. Can you elaborate on what you mentioned, micro internships?
I guess on the micro internships, so the way we're understanding folks that we're hearing is that it's just, how do you create these smaller opportunities with kind of less obligation on the employer side, just to make it easy, but that can give the exposure to both sides. So both the workplace then becomes a little more familiar, like, with folks. Like, the reality is if you look, say, in Quebec and other places where the polling was coming out saying we want less immigration, the folks who wanted less immigrants were the folks who did not have immigrants coming to their communities. Like, they had no exposure whatsoever. And so our thinking, the thinking behind this is expose more businesses to and people in the businesses to newcomers, but at the same time it gives the newcomers an opportunity to see what's going on in the workplace with very little obligation on either side.
All right, we're down to the wire. So final thoughts. There's a big question that maybe you can all riff on, because we inevitably come to talk technology when it comes to this. So 30 seconds each. Do you think a digital tool that matches newcomer skills with the economic needs of specific regions could influence employment outcomes and long-term settlement success? And what features, give me your top 3, would you consider essential for such a tool to effectively guide newcomers to the right regions? So Nick, start with you.
Yeah, a digital tool always makes more sense. I mean, Marco, you and I've talked about the number of times I've met an oil and gas engineer in Toronto. And I said, why? I don't even understand why. It doesn't make sense. So yes, but there's so much what we're talking about. A lot of this could be done simply, and we talked about this. When the express entry was created, there is the ability to actually flag them when they're talking about their employment and say, listen, yes, I understand that's where you want to go, but this is perhaps where you should be going because this is what it looks like. They're not going to find that out.
All right, digital matchmaking and make it happen early in the process. Patrick.
I'd pick up on that pre-arrival. I'd say pre-application. You really need to give people a much better sense pre-application of what's going to work for them. What would life potentially look like employment-wise if you're going to make this choice, and then let them make an informed decision.
Well, but thank you. Michael, final thoughts to you.
So Marco, you know me already. I'm a big believer in technology and in innovation. The only thing I would add is technology that brings employers and job seekers in this area, but also do it in a seamless, continuous manner, not transactional, not one thing at a time, but continuously.
Wonderful. Thank you. We could do this for hours, as I think all of you have already alluded to. So thank you to our audience for being with us. We're at the end of today's session. The presentation slides will be made available later, but thank you for your questions, for your interactions, and thank you especially the three of you for sharing your wisdom, insight, and for jumping in on this really important topic. Take care,
Marco,
everybody.
thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah.